They say that all good things must come to an end, and Sean Dyche's time at Burnley was undoubtedly a very good thing. Over the course of almost a decade at the club, which is a remarkable achievement in of itself in the modern game, Dyche led Burnley from the bottom half of the Championship table to 2 promotions to the Premier League. He kept them up for 5 successive seasons, and he even guided the Clarets to a remarkable 7th place finish in the Premier League in the 2017-18 season, and thus qualified for Europe. What's more, Dyche did all that at a club in a town of fewer than 100,000 people, in a so-called unfashionable part of England, where a number of teams have gone in the opposite direction in recent years, and he did it all on a shoestring budget. Over the past 5 seasons, Burnley's net spend has barely exceeded £20 million, which is less than the likes of Stoke City, Cardiff City, and Huddersfield Town during that time, and less than 1/7 of what Fulham have spent over the same period. Personally, I do fear for Burnley under their newish owners, whose takeover of a fantastically run football club took Burnley from having no debt to being £90 million worse off and absolutely loaded with debt. And they now face a huge crossroads when it comes to appointing Sean Dyche's successor, having essentially ripped the heart, spine, and indeed the gravelly voice out of that football club. Nonetheless, to celebrate Dyche's near decade at Turf Moor, following a number of requests, I thought I'd take a look at the former Chesterfield centre-back's very first starting 11 as Burnley boss, who lined up against a Wolverhampton Wanderers team containing the likes of Jermaine Pennant and Sylvan Ebanks-Blake in November 2012, and see where those players are now. Burnley started that game 4 points behind Wolves in the bottom half of the Championship table, but following a 2-0 win, they went on to finish the season in 11th. Meanwhile, Wolves went on an absolutely atrocious run of form and were relegated for the 2nd successive season. Without further ado then, here is Sean Dyche's first starting 11 as Burnley boss. Where are those players now? Lee Grant, Manchester United. Not to be confused with the Oscar-nominated American actress Lee Grant, who is in her mid-90s now, the Lee Grant who was in goal for Burnley in Sean Dyche's first game in charge of the club now plays for Manchester United, a little-known football club from the northwest of England who younger viewers might not know that much about, but who were once actually very successful in English football. It should be said, Lee Grant the actress, and I do accept that this is a pretty wild tangent even by my standards, has lived a fairly extraordinary life. She actually received her Oscar nomination in her film debut in 1951, aged 26, but she was blacklisted for the next 12 years, the colloquial term for Hollywood actors and directors who were frozen out of the industry during the era of McCarthyism due to accusations that they were communists or communist sympathisers, and therefore she had to find work as a teacher instead. After returning to the industry, Grant won an Academy Award for Best Documentary Feature after she directed Down and Out in America. Admittedly, none of this has anything to do with Sean Dyche or with Burnley, but don't ever accuse this channel of lacking range. Lee Grant the footballer was fortunate enough not to be blacklisted or accused of being a communist during the era of McCarthyism in America, but he would be blacklisted by Dyche, sort of, who allowed him to depart for Derby County during his first summer in charge, as he signed Tom Heaton instead. Heaton ended up being brilliant for Burnley before losing his place to Nick Pope, and rather coincidentally, both Heaton and Grant now play for Manchester United. Well, that's a bit of a stretch. They both train at Manchester United and get paid by Manchester United, but in 4 seasons at Old Trafford, Grant has played just 2 games, whilst Heaton has played only once since arriving in the summer from Aston Villa. Grant and Heaton have a combined age of 75, which is still 20 years less than Hollywood legend Lee Grant has on her own. Alright, I'll move on now. Kieran Trippier, Newcastle United. Undoubtedly one of Burnley's biggest success stories during Sean Dyche's time at the club, the former Burnley boss might be accused of being old school and slightly defensive at times, but Kieran Trippier was about as advanced and as creative as any other fullback in England during his 4 seasons in Lancashire. Burnley's primary creative outlet, Trippier's balls into the box were one of Dyche's most lethal weapons during his early years at the club, before Trippier was sold for £3.5 million to Tottenham, a modest fee made possible due to a buyout clause in the fullback's contract. Trippier went on to play more than 100 games for Tottenham under Maurizio Pochettino, where he reached a Champions League final, he won the La Liga title last season with Atletico Madrid, and he has been capped 35 times by England. Now aged 31, Trippier returned to England in January in a move to Newcastle United, where he made a barnstorming start and became an immediate fan favourite before breaking his foot following only 5 games for the club. Michael Duff, Cheltenham Town manager. Not to be confused with the British theoretical physicist Michael Duff, who has done some pioneering work within the field of supergravity, the Michael Duff who started at centre-back in Sean Dyche's first game in charge of Burnley played a massive 383 games for the Clarets. But it must be said, his output in relation to unified theories of the elementary particles has been sorely lacking when compared to his namesake. Duff only ever played for 2 Football League teams, Cheltenham Town and Burnley, as well as winning 24 caps for Northern Ireland. Having hung up his boots in 2016, while still at Burnley, Duff now manages his first club, Cheltenham Town, who he guided to automatic promotion from League 2 last season. Despite a rough patch of recent form, Cheltenham are currently on course for their highest ever league finish, at least as far as I can tell, so overall, Duff is doing a very decent job. Jason Shackell, free agent. I am always reluctant to retire players on this channel, so despite the fact that Jason Shackell is 38 years old and has been without a club for almost 2 years, I will await official confirmation from the man himself that he is giving up the game before I describe him as being retired, rather than as a free agent. A man who I associate most strongly with Barnsley, despite the fact that he spent just a single season in South Yorkshire, Shackell was outstanding at Oakwell, before making what was then quite a big money move to Derby County. Derby turned a profit on Shackell when they sold him to Burnley in 2012, and Burnley would also turn a profit on the centre-back when they sold him back to Derby in 2015. Shackell played 136 games for Burnley over the course of those 3 seasons, and he most recently played for Lincoln City, with whom he won promotion from League 2, but the club chose not to extend his contract in May 2020. Ben Mee, Burnley. Burnley's second longest serving player, behind only Kevin Long, Ben Mee first joined the Clarets on loan from Manchester City in June 2011, before signing on a permanent basis in the following January transfer window. Mee has played 376 games for Burnley since then, the vast majority of them coming under Sean Dyche, but he now finds himself in rather an unusual situation. Currently out injured, since Dyche's sacking, Mee has been appointed as a caretaker assistant manager, along with Paul Jenkins and Connor King, to caretaker boss Mike Jackson. As I have said a number of times on this channel, I think Mee has long been underrated, and he has comfortably been among the most solid and consistent left-sided centre-backs in the Premier League over the last 5 or 6 seasons. As Burnley's club captain and leader, Mee may well one day make a permanent venture into coaching. But for now, he'll just be looking to get back on the pitch for Burnley as soon as possible, as the club batters bitterly to stay in the Premier League. David Edgar, assistant manager at Forge FC. Not to be confused with the British playwright David Edgar, who is among the most prolific dramatists of the modern era. The David Edgar who started for Burnley in Sean Dyche's first game in charge of the club against Wolverhampton Wanderers has never written a single play, or at least he hasn't written one which has reached the production stage. Born in Ontario, Edgar did win 42 caps for Canada, but his retirement from international football in 2019 coincided with the national team's long-awaited rise and, ultimately, even more recently, their qualification for the 2022 World Cup. Formerly of Newcastle United, Edgar spent 5 years at Burnley before moves to Birmingham City, Vancouver Whitecaps, and Nashville. He retired from football in 2020 following a single season at two-time Canadian champions Forge FC in the brand new Canadian Premier League, where he now serves as the club's assistant manager. Brian Stock, unemployed coach. It is remarkable, really, quite how many of Sean Dyche's starting 11 from his first game as Burnley boss have equally or even more famous namesakes. And just for the avoidance of doubt, because I know a lot of you will be thinking it, no, the American historian and 12th century culture and society expert Brian Stock, who used to lecture at the University of Toronto, never played for Burnley under Sean Dyche. Nor did he before or after Dyche's era at Turf Moor. Former Wales international Brian Stock did, however, having made 42 appearances in 2 seasons with the Clarets between 2012 and 2014. Having hung up his boots in 2019 after 5 years with Havant and Waterlooville in the non-league game, Stock, who is now aged 40, managed Weymouth from 2020 to 2022. He lost his job in January following 7 successive defeats, so I suppose you could say that his stock seemingly isn't high enough yet for anyone else to have offered him a job. Dean Marney, free agent. Much like Jason SHACKELL, Dean Marney is 38 years old and he hasn't had a club for 2 years, but until I hear it from the man himself, I refuse to state that he has retired. I have actually spoken to Dean Marney before, on the phone, when I was 11 years old and he was playing for Hull City. My mum's friend saw him and Richard Garcia on an evening in a restaurant, called my mum, knowing that I was Hull City mad, and asked them both to speak to me. Garcia was an absolute gent and stayed on the phone for what felt like ages, answering all of what I thought at the time were truly excellent questions. Meanwhile, Marney seemed to be what I can only describe as deeply irritated to be stuck on the phone to an 11-year-old me. Now that I am old and wise and am constantly being harangued by adoring fans when going about my daily business, I can understand his attitude. But at the time, I was fairly bitter about it. That was one of Alfie's incredible anecdotes. Join us this time next week for another one.
Alfie's incredible anecdotes.
Yet another celebrity name drop done and dusted, and having made you all outrageously jealous about the fact that I have actually spoken to the Dean Marney on the phone and interrupted one of his meals, I should talk very briefly about the player himself. Marney joined Hull City from Spurs with a big reputation, and whilst he was excellent in the Championship, he struggled a little in the Premier League. Burnley signed him in 2010 for £600,000, and he went on to prove what a truly excellent second-tier player he was, becoming a firm fan favourite at Turf Moor, and even enjoying a couple of extra seasons in the Premier League. Marney joined Fleetwood Town under former teammate Joey Barton in the summer of 2018, but he only made 19 appearances in 2 years at Highbury before being released by the Cods. Ross Wallace, Burnley under-18s coach. The only other one of Burnley's starters from Sean Dyche's first game in charge of the club, alongside Ben Mee, who is still at Turf Moor, Ross Wallace is now the assistant coach for Burnley's under-18s, looking to develop youth team players at the club. A graduate of the Celtic Academy himself, Wallace was capped once by Scotland in 2009, shortly before signing for Burnley, and he went on to play 165 games in 5 seasons at the club. A diminutive and exciting wide man with a great left foot, Wallace was sold by Sean Dyche following Burnley's 2015 relegation from the Premier League, and he went on to play for Sheffield Wednesday, Fleetwood Town and St Mirren before hanging up his boots and turning his attention to coaching. He currently holds a UEFA B licence, at least according to his LinkedIn profile. Charlie Austin, Queen's Park Rangers. Whether it be Jay Rodriguez, Danny Ings or Andre Gray, Burnley went through a period where they just always seemed to have really good strikers in the Championship, and Charlie Austin certainly belonged to that collection. Signed by Burnley from Swindon Town, Austin spent just 2 full seasons at Turf Moor before he was signed by Queen's Park Rangers. including 28 goals in 45 games during the season that Sean Dyche arrived. That was to be Austin's last season at the club, meaning that he and Dyche wouldn't get to work together for long, but Austin reached yet new heights in West London. After helping fire QPR to promotion, he scored 18 Premier League goals as the club were relegated, which was the fourth most of any player in the league that season. Austin soon departed for Southampton, where he would be unable to replicate those kinds of numbers, and he has been back at Loftus Road since January 2021. Martin Patterson, Inter Miami assistant. The second Northern Irish international in Sean Dyche's first starting 11 at Burnley, Martin Patterson played far more games for the Clarets than he ever did for anyone else. Often the bridesmaid rather than the bride in Burnley strike partnerships, alongside some of the forwards that I reeled off only a moment ago, Patterson scored 37 goals in 151 games at Turf Moor. Once described by Eddie Howe as being a real grafter, though Patterson wasn't the most prolific, he often brought out the best in the likes of Stephen Fletcher or indeed Charlie Austin. Patterson retired fairly young in 2018 at the age of only 30, following stints in the United States and in India, almost immediately moving into coaching in America. Having served as an assistant head coach at Fort Lauderdale FC since 2020, he stepped up from Inter Miami's feeder team to the first team in 2022, becoming Phil Neville's assistant. That was Sean Dyche's first starting 11 at Burnley, along with some absolutely fascinating insight into people with the same name as players who played for Burnley during Sean Dyche's first game in charge, and even a gripping anecdote about my phone call with Dean Marney as an 11-year-old. But I know what you're all thinking. You're wondering, who were the substitutes that day? Well, fear not, as I'm about to tell you. Starting with those who actually came on, Danny Ings was the first to be introduced after 70 minutes in place of Ross Wallace, and he now plays for Aston Villa under Steven Gerrard. Then came Junior Stanislas, who was brought on after 81 minutes and has been with Bournemouth since 2014, followed by Sam Vokes, who currently plays for Wycombe Wanderers. Burnley's unused substitutes were goalkeeper Brian Jensen, now aged 46, and a goalkeeping coach at Shrewsbury Town, Kevin Long, who is still at Burnley and is the club's longest serving and indeed the Premier League's fifth longest serving player at any single club, Cameron Stewart, who looked to be a real star in the making at Hull City, but his loan move to Burnley was the beginning of his downfall and he ended up retiring aged only 28, and finally Daniel Lafferty, who spent 5 years at Burnley but spent most of them out on loan and who now plays for Derry City in the League of Ireland Premier Division. That is it for today's video, but thank you all sincerely from the bottom of my heart as ever for watching. I thoroughly hope that you enjoyed today's video. Hit the like button if that was the case, let me know your thoughts down below in the comments, and make sure that you are subscribed and have notifications turned on for HITC Sevens. You can also find me on social media on either Twitter or Instagram, why not, via the username at HITC Sevens, should you wish to do so. That is the username on both of those platforms, just to be clear.